Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the personality characteristics from the characters in the sitcom Friends. Right, so Friends was a popular television show that ran from 1994 to 2004. It had 236 episodes. It was exceedingly well written, well acted, and is really a great example of how a cast can come together and have chemistry. Even though it ended in 2004, it's still an exceedingly popular television show right now, right? So we see it in terms of reruns all the time. And we see new generations watching Friends and becoming interested in that show and getting involved in that storyline. Now, clearly in this video there will be spoilers, right? Because I'll be talking about a lot of different parts of the series, so I want to mention that. And because I'm talking about personality and potentially kind of mental health issues, just a reminder that I'm not diagnosing anybody. I'm talking about the characters here, not the actors that played the characters. So the format to the show Friends is interesting and fairly straightforward. We see 6 characters who start out in their 20s, and by the end of the series they're in their 30s. The real actors who played the characters were fairly close in age to the age of the characters. And even though Courtney Cox was the best known of the group when the show started out, really all of these actors were essentially unknown. None of them were established or popular actors. Of course, by the time the series ended, that was completely changed, and it changed really dramatically, specifically for Jennifer Aniston. So we see in the series that the characters deal with a lot of situations like jobs, romantic relationships, kind of figuring out their own identity, who they are. The show is generally lighthearted, obviously a comedy, but there are certainly some strong feelings and strong emotional situations explored throughout the series as well. One key idea here for Friends I think is particularly interesting is that generally the amount of time, the amount of screen time for each character was somewhat balanced over the course of each season, and to some extent even in each episode. So each of the 6 characters are really considered equal, which is somewhat different than what we see with a lot of other sitcoms. So in terms of looking at the personality characteristics, this show of course not only had the 10 seasons, but again that balance I was talking about. So there's a lot of information available about each character. So a personality assessment can be done somewhat reliably with all that information. We also see some character development. We see the characters start out one way, and to some extent they change throughout the course of the 10 years, the 10 seasons. Now, to some extent, each episode can stand on its own, but there are also larger narratives that extend throughout the seasons and, of course, the whole series, like the tumultuous relationship between the Ross and Rachel characters. So in looking at the personalities of the characters, there are a few different ways I could arrange this video. I decided to look at each of the big 5 personality traits and rank the characters on that trait. So I'll start with the characters who are highest in a particular trait and move to characters that are lowest in a particular trait. So when talking about the 5-factor model of personality theory, I remember this model through the acronym OCEAN. We see openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I think it's a fairly good way to assess and conceptualize personality characteristics. So I'll start out with openness to experience. Somebody who's high in openness appreciates art. They like abstract thinking, theories. They're intellectually curious, imaginative, creative, adventurous, and they tend to fantasize. They spend a lot of time kind of in a fantasy world. So again, going from the highest level to the lowest level, I would say the highest level of openness would have to be Phoebe, right? She has odd beliefs. She's attracted to artwork. She's willing to try anything, so she's adventurous. She's extremely creative, and she works as a musician. Next in line, it gets a little more difficult. I would have to say probably Ross. He's a university professor, so he's philosophically oriented. Then I would go to Monica and Chandler, and the next would be Rachel, because Rachel's not really willing to invest a lot of intellectual energy in a lot of different topics, so she's lower in terms of openness to experience. And the lowest in openness to experience would be Joey. He's rigid in terms of his thinking and tends to think in a simple way. He's not attracted to complex philosophical theories. Now it's interesting because one of the few criticisms we do see of the show Friends is that the characters, Rachel and Joey, were underdeveloped. And of course, this would be consistent with low openness to experience. So in a sense, it makes sense that they weren't that developed if they were low in openness. So that could be kind of a counter to that particular criticism. Overall, if we consider all the characters together, the level of openness to experience we see here with these characters is higher than what we would tend to see in the population. So now moving on to conscientiousness. This trait is characterized by being reliable, hardworking, productive, consistent, steady, organized, and decisive. So going from the most conscientious to the least conscientious, this is actually pretty interesting because it would appear that the writers of the show Friends were trying to make Monica the most conscientious character. She expresses obsessive-compulsive traits, and these are generally thought of as being associated with conscientiousness. However, I would actually make the argument that Chandler is the most conscientious character. He maintains relatively stable employment. I know it's not through the entire series, but most of the time he's employed. He's industrious, he's really not impulsive, and generally speaking, he can be relied upon. I also see him as just a little bit more decisive than Monica. Certainly Monica would be the second highest in terms of conscientiousness, but not higher than Chandler. Monica looks out for the other characters, and she prides herself on good decision-making. So again, certainly she would be conscientious. Now, despite repeated bad decisions throughout the series in terms of his love life, Ross would probably be the next highest, then Rachel, especially considering her character a little later in the series when she kind of gets her career dialed in a bit. After this, I would move to Joey and then Phoebe. It's kind of a toss-up between the two. Both seem fairly impulsive, both have an inconsistent work history, but if I had to pick, I would put Joey as just a little bit more conscientious than Phoebe. Overall, I would say that the conscientiousness level we see with these characters is a bit lower than what we would see in the population. And this is probably done to make the show interesting. It's easier to create comedic situations from impulsive decisions that lead to all kinds of problems that need to be fixed than if you had a bunch of highly organized and productive people as the characters in the show. The next trait is extraversion. Now, extroverts are comfortable in crowds, assertive, friendly, outgoing, disinhibited, talkative, and tend to have positive emotions. They tend to be, in a sense, happier than people who are low on extraversion. Now, we see that extroverts tend to be overrepresented on television shows. And I think this is because the characters really need to talk and interact with one another to have something to record, to have something meaningful to put on television. A show that featured 6 people sitting around thinking in silence probably wouldn't be a hit. So starting with the highest in extroversion, this is a tough one because all these characters are essentially extroverted, but if I had to choose, I would probably say Joey. His character is, of course, an actor in the show, generally positive, friendly, gregarious, and certainly comfortable in crowds. Next would be Phoebe. She also performs in front of people. She's more assertive than Joey, to the point of being aggressive sometimes, but her character is not as friendly and outgoing as Joey. After that, I would say Rachel. She's assertive, friendly, definitely talkative, and doesn't mind being the center of attention. Then I would move to Ross, Monica, and Chandler. So Chandler would be the least extroverted here. Chandler insults people under his breath many times during the show. I think this is really a comedic device that is used to make his character likable and, of course, to be funny. We see that the other characters are not as subtle. So that's why I chose Chandler for having the lowest level of extroversion. The average level of extroversion we see with these characters, as I indicated, is clearly much higher than what we would see in the population. So the next trait is agreeableness. And agreeableness is characterized by trust, being gentle and kind, having a lot of empathy, following the rules, and being straightforward. Now, straightforward, when it's used in terms of talking about agreeableness, means that when somebody's talking, they're not really holding anything back. They're not really thinking about what they're saying and maybe being a little bit deceptive. They're just laying it all out there, right? So essentially not choosing their words carefully, but because they don't really have anything to hide. So starting with the highest level of agreeableness, I would actually say this would be Joey, right? He tends to believe people. He's easily manipulated. He's not malicious. He's not comfortable being in arguments with other people. And he's straightforward even when that's not good for him, right? We see that several times. He tends to be generous as well, but he's not modest. And I think this is really due to a lack of awareness. He doesn't realize what people consider talented as opposed to not being talented. And this is a lot different than him thinking he's great or special. I think his lack of modesty could still be somewhat consistent with agreeableness because of where that lack of modesty comes from. So next I would say Ross. He doesn't tend to trust people, but he is kind and caring, and he generally follows the rules. Of course, we see some notable exceptions, like when he has a relationship with a student. He's a university professor, and he has a romantic relationship with a student. But overall, he does tend to follow the rules. Then I would move to Monica, Chandler, and then Rachel. Especially in the beginning, Rachel tends to be narcissistic. She likes nice jewelry and clothes because she believes those things indicate high status. She also drastically overestimates her worth. She shows low modesty. And all these things are consistent with low agreeableness. So at the lowest level of agreeableness, I would put Phoebe. And this is because she doesn't trust people very much at all. She isn't necessarily kind and caring either. She does tend to break the rules, and she does leave important information out of narratives. She's not particularly modest either. For example, she overestimates her musical talent by quite a bit. Now, the overall level of agreeableness we see in the characters is probably higher than what we see in the population. So the last trait in the 5-factor model is neuroticism. And in sitcoms, we tend to see really high levels of neuroticism, because with low levels of neuroticism, there wouldn't be a lot happening, right? Because neuroticism is characterized by emotional lability, so being emotionally unstable. It's also characterized by being insecure, angry, depressed, anxious, hostile, and being impulsive. But specifically with impulsivity, it's in the sense of not being able to resist temptation. So that's different from the impulsivity we see measured on conscientiousness. So starting with the highest level of neuroticism, I would say it's probably going to be Rachel. Early on, we see she's kind of all over the map with emotions, and it takes her 10 years to figure out this relationship between her and Ross. With that in mind, I would put Ross next in line. He's insecure, and he gets impulsively married a few times during the show. After this, it gets pretty difficult. I would probably say Monica. We see she has this history of having a difficulty in resisting the temptation of food. And we see she has a lot of anxiety around perfectionism. She wants things to be a certain way. I would put Phoebe next in line. We see some kind of conflicting information. She doesn't appear to be depressed or anxious, but she is more hostile than the other members of the group. Next would be Chandler. He has difficulty resisting the temptation of smoking cigarettes, and he's somewhat insecure. And in terms of the lowest level of neuroticism, I would say it would be Joey. He tends to be relatively stable in terms of emotions, and of course we see he's very confident. Even if he shouldn't be confident some of the time, he does seem to be quite confident. I mentioned before that neuroticism tends to be high in sitcoms, but I would say the average level of neuroticism for these characters would be about the same as what we see in the population. On the issue of character development, I mentioned that there were some criticisms that people had about the lack of character development in the show Friends. Character development isn't about changing personality. Personality really doesn't change too much over the lifespan. It's really about how a character matures and develops in a way where they can figure out who they are. So really about finding oneself. So looking at the character development from most to least, I would say Chandler, Monica, Rachel, Ross, Phoebe, and Joey. Now, of course, there will always be a rank order. There will always be a way to rank the characters in terms of development, unless they were all exactly equal, which of course they weren't. I think another key question here would be, was the development enough for the show? So I would have liked to seen more meaningful development in Rachel and Joey, as many critics have noted, but also with Phoebe and Ross. But overall, I think the character development was fine. I think it worked for the purpose of the show. Friends was supposed to be a lighthearted comedy that had a lot of chemistry between the characters. I think the character development that we saw on the show was consistent with that purpose. So there's my take on the personality of the characters in the show Friends. I know this was a popular show and there's a lot of opinions about the show. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They're sure to generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the personalities in the show Friends to be interesting. Thanks for watching.